All right, welcome everyone to the June edition of the Ethics of Argumentation speaker series. Today we have a special pleasure. We have Alain Létourneau speaking to us. He is a full professor of philosophy and applied ethics at the Université de Sherbrooke. I'm incredibly sorry for my French. When I took French class after the first year, my teacher took me aside and said, "Kat, are you going to come back for this next year? Because if you don't, I can give you a D. And if you do, I have to be honest." So my pronunciation is accordingly bad. I'm very sorry. But thank you so much for coming. Alain Létourneau is an incredibly accomplished scholar who's published more than 10 books and more than 100 articles. And today he's going to talk to us about discussing the scheme. You plead for action X, but your actions are themselves in contradiction with X, as seen in the environmental field. Please take it away, Alain. Oh, you're still muted.
Thank you so much, Kat, and also Andrew, for inviting me for this presentation. I'm quite happy to share my research with you guys. So I'm going to share my screen, which should be easily done normally. So, are you seeing something? Are you seeing a presentation or?
No, so far only the website, the Zoom website.
Okay, I'm going to start again then. Sorry. And
There it
now?
is. Yep.
Okay, sorry about this. Okay, so this is my title. You plead for action X, but your actions are themselves in contradiction with X. So I will start by providing a declaration of potential or real conflict of interest, in the sense that I might not be a climate scientist, but I do work in climate ethics. I have published papers. I also supervise students in the PhD and the master's degree. So that's one point. And the other point is that I live in the city of Montreal, and I take planes mostly, but not only, for conferences. So some years I take planes more than others. This year being a particular case, since I am on a leave from teaching for 2 semesters. So I've been flying even more than in normal times. So the particular sentence I would like to look at with you and discuss with you will be the following. Why should I follow X when X calls for a ban on fossil fuels, when he, she, or they frequently take the plane for conferences and vacations? So obviously in this case we have one actor X that seems discredited because of his or her being in apparent contradiction. But of course, we will look at it more closely as the presentation goes on. And this is one case, among others, of obviously many similar moves have taken place in the recent years. I prefer to work on a single construct to simplify the task. So this is my choice. The quote above seems just a case of a much larger rhetorical figure. It can happen that a given and debatable decision or action of a person in the past is called upon for discrediting the same person's capability of accomplishing some new mandate. This is basically an ad hominem in different forms, as Walton explains. We have cases where some past curricula, for instance, a criminal one, can justify the exclusion of that person for some responsibilities. Then, of course, it is a valid argument. It might not always be acceptable, either by lack of gravity of the past acts versus the characteristics of the new mandate, or by lack of relevance and similarity between a supposed new mandate and some previous actions. In any case, the move will be to emphasize the discrepancy between acts and prescriptive discourse. Person X has done action 1, and then the same person X tells other people not to do action 1 among other actions of the same kind. I want also to say a little about my position as a speaker. I adopt an interdisciplinary perspective in what I call a practical philosophy. And just to spell out what I mean by this expression, I theorize it as a field of interrogation structured by the main questions of philosophy, considers as its topoi, in particular the ethical, the epistemological, the political question, and the communicational question, considered both as rhetorical and argumentative at the same time. And in practical philosophy, two elements count: to keep these questions connected and to address them about a given practice domain with the relevant interdisciplinary and interprofessional partners, at least when it is possible. And here the said domain would be environmental governance issues, especially climate change. I would say a little more. For me, it is inside some relationships and pursuing specific aims that argumentation occurs as a situated practice. We always argue for and with people, not in isolation or outside some social interaction, whether it is direct or mediated through text and otherwise. The analysis cannot just be one of fallacies in the abstract. I also follow Bakhtin in situating dialogically an argument. Arguments are enacted in a plurality of different forms. They can take place in discussion with epistemic communities, with reference to time-space reference, for instance, fields, what Bakhtin called chronotopes. I also have to put some contextual elements in perspective. As societies, we are faced with difficult issues. Data is available to attest biodiversity is unequally diminishing, climate stability is jeopardized, and therefore social and economic and political stability are also problematic. Population movements are documented. People are confronted with a multiplicity of crises at the same time: cultural, economic, ethnical, or ideological, not only to climate change and biodiversity loss, due not only to these, but to the other elements also. These crises are mutually aggravating each other. These issues lead us to normative requirements associated with climate change, loss of biodiversity, pervasiveness of different kinds of pollutants, lot of food production capability linked to deforestation, ocean acidification. All these phenomena are occurring as extended temporal phenomena in the long run. I will name these requirements environmental claims in general. Well, these normative and prescriptive claims also present themselves with urgency, as we can see with the IPCC or IPBES on biodiversity. Those requirements are relevant not only for individuals, but also for organized bodies, political and economic actors. And one obvious way to deal with all these requirements is try to avoid them or to deny them. So I did a little literature review about the kind of figure I'm interested in here. And the relevant schemes that are most of the times referred to are the ad personam, the tu quoque, the two wrongs, whataboutism. And this plurality is already surprising and interesting as a phenomenon. As an example of whataboutism, we have, of course, the very famous What About China that we've heard a number of times. Gauvier had treated that before, Tyndale, Walton, Reed, and Macagno. All these figures are treated, of course, by these guys. Most of the times, and in the tradition of the ad personam literature, would emphasize the blame, the attack on persons who are blamed for their incoherence. And more recently, authors have underscored new elements. For instance, we have relevant remarks on important links between hypocrisy and the tu quoque, article from Aiken, and the meta-argumentative nature of whataboutism from Aiken and Casey. There is also the lengthy analysis of Jean Goodwin that needs to be considered. in her paper of 2020, a systems perspective is adopted while studying online corpora, considering a great number of Twitter interventions. The analysis accumulates in a scheme which is really a group of signifiers comprising the different nuances encountered in the corpora. See our paper. Our research gets into the advocates of the flyless movement, confronted and confronting other climate researchers pleading for structural change. There were clearly two tendencies in the confrontation, and the present paper will be this paper will be called back in some of the following. There's this famous quote from Walton, just to get us back in the ground. The parent says the following: there is strong evidence of a link between smoking and chronic obstructive lung disease. Smoking is also associated with many other serious disorders. Smoking is unhealthy, so you should not smoke. To which the child responds, but you smoke yourself, so much for your argument against smoking. So in the critical questions that follow, Walton expresses the universality claim, which is implicit in the parent's recommendation. There is no apparent reason that the parent should be treated as an exception. We must then ask ourselves if the parent can be deemed a bad person on this basis, and supposing this being the case, is this a good reason to say the parent's argument should be refused? But we should note that the point of the exchange is not so much on blaming the parent as on the neutralization of the argument, as is shown by saying, so much for your argument. So the issue is not so much the credibility, but it is the value of the prescription. So we have a group of schemes by which some reprehensible practice of a speaker A is invoked by a second party, called him Speaker B, against the validity of a claim made by Speaker A, which has been named, as I said before, differently. Lots of variants are obviously possible on top of these appellations as new subcategories. For instance, poisoning the wells. Walton refers to this in his book, 1998. But this move of B respective to A's behavior and pleading is destined to a third element, C, which is normally the audience, a more or less open group of interpreters. Readers of Charles Sanders Peirce's philosophical work might know that the relation is triadic and not dyadic. When we look at issues at the collective level, there's a new twist that is occurring. For instance, if we are discussing stricter measures to ensure protection against further aggravation of climate change effects in a country, we will have this what about China or India or Russia that can pop up, and that did pop up on occasion. One wrong is deemed bigger than ours. It can also then be described as a two wrong argument. But I would remark that it becomes a variant of us versus them, and we directly touch the issue of collective action problems, the crux of the matter concerning climate change. Reasons invoked by political actors often consider the performance of other countries in a comparison that can sometimes serve to justify more or less radicality in the norms to be adopted. In this case, again, the move is not a way to discredit the other countries, but mostly a rhetorical device going in the direction of business as usual for ourselves. Concerning the attack of incoherence, that seems to be the crucial matter here. So this figure of or scheme does not always appear as an attack on the person, contrary to what expresses the very syntagm ad personam. Can also simply aim and function to discredit the action prescribed. And of course, it can do the two things at once, attacking both the person and the prescriptions. Since other expressions can be used, like whataboutism, etc., to describe the case of interest here, it seems that the crux of the matter is the attack of incoherence. I suggest, therefore, to use that name to describe the figure. A specific attention toward the given speaker or writer can be present, but is it the crucial element? The pleader might be incoherent, but the gist of the move from the opponent is to impeach the prescription. Many discussants have underscored the independence of the content of the prescription with the past behavior of the person, at least in principle. See the books quoted here. But to diminish the credibility of the prescriber indirectly attacks the content of the prescription. In some cases, it is not so much a call for more coherence than a way to downplay the prescription, to destroy the force of the message. Lack of coherence becomes a kind of proof of the nullity of the prescription. Coherence has to do much more with the continuity between action and deeds than with the behavior of the prescription in isolation. A discrepancy between the one and the other is seen prima facie as problematic. There are some interesting cases, variants on this. There's this intervention from Al Gore. In some cases, the attack on lack of coherence seems to work as a kind of ad hominem. See Al Gore intervening about the Abu Dhabi COP28 presidency. In that case, Gore underscores a situation that goes much further than just blaming the guy and discrediting him for past behaviors. What Gore does there is trying to show a conflict of interest between two mandates, for instance, as CEO of an important oil consortium on the one side, and as the chair of the COP28 on the other side, which is normally devoted to lessening the general dependence on fossil fuels. That intervention by Gore is not there to downplay some prescription, but it amounts to say that such a chairmanship can only weaken the results, meaning the prescriptive force expected from the Conference of the Parties on Climate. Any other person who would have been in a similar conflict of interest would have been disqualified in Gore's perspective. There again, we find an ad hominem that aims at prescriptive aims or ends, but not to diminish the force of the prescription. The contrary is the case here. So originally the clip was on Twitter, it has disappeared, and now we can find it back in YouTube. I want now to make a little partial clarification of the situation. So we recapitulate about the formulation I previously announced before looking at a possible variant. So I will recall it. Why should I do what X prescribes when X calls for a ban on fossil fuels, when she or they frequently take the plane for conferences and vacations? As we can see in such a formulation, the main point is not to attack X, but to discredit the prescription advanced by X. In that case, the radical action X suggests avoiding should normally include the action he or she continues to perform. There is therefore not only a lack of coherence, but also a kind of contradiction in terms between words and deeds. If we look more closely, the contradictions might be in appearance only. The first part of the sentence debates a prescription, a boycott, which would imply many different actions from many different actors. It would be a set including uses for eating, transporting, transforming, plowing the fields, repairing the streets, etc. Public decision makers would have to get involved at many different levels. The second part of the argument concerns an individual who happens to have committed one action amongst the set of actions that he or she prescribes we forego. The argument says nothing about the other behaviors of the individual. Does the person use fossil fuels for eating? What car, if there is one, is the person using? Etc. We can also imagine a variant form of the argument, number 2, that would be formulated as such. Why should I follow climatologists' requirement to abandon the use of fossil fuels when these scientists continue taking planes for vacations and work? In that case, it is a whole class of people, a group of scientists, which is accused without any specific proof or data, obviously, of being a bunch of hypocrites. No proof has been given that all the scientists are taking planes. In the sentence, boycott has been replaced by simple abandonment prescribed to a specific person. It is the simplest form, but basically the structure is the same based on breaches of coherence, and in this case, without sufficient backing. I have a little part of reflection in the context of ethical theory. For me, this is an important part of the discussion here. So traditionally, ethical questions are seen as concerning individuals and their behaviors, especially with singular others. Let us recall formulations like, you should not kill, or do unto others what you would expect them to do to you. In these kinds of moral norms, the person is the addressee, the claim is supposed to be valid in general, even if there can be recognized exceptions. One classical way of thinking about moral issues, which comes from a very noble position, sees moral behavior as a question of personal virtue. The search for excellence in action, arete, in given attitudes, for instance, courage, and in our case, coherence between words and actions. I would just remark in passing that this idea of coherence is not a part of the usual list of virtues, and we will see a reason why later. Another and different common ground for moral thinking is represented by duty, referring to norms for which universalization would be acceptable, opposition habitually linked to Kant. And there is also the tradition referring to utility from Bentham, Mill, and Sedgwick to their more recent reprisals or adaptations like David Gautier. Criticizing Bentham and Mill for their hedonistic anthropology, in treating virtue, John Dewey will keep the criteria of the evaluation of the consequences of a given action on all affected. This is what is proper of a virtue ethics perspective, according to him. But in all these traditions, the moral agent is by default considered as an individual person, able to judge, to weigh the elements of the situation and take a decision, considering either or the worth of the action, the character involved, and or the consequences choices will have. In that general context, obviously, the coherence between a person's claim and a person's action will look as important. Again, what spontaneously comes to mind is always linked to a person's life. For instance, we will not accept a person saying to his or her spouse, I forbid you to sleep with another than me, while the person will apply a different standard for him or herself. Here we are in the traditional range of what is usually called the golden rule mentioned previously. That being said, for decades, ethical thinkers have required that we begin to reflect more at the collective level. Our collective predicament compels us to consider things at that socio-historical level. Two names stand out on that respect, Hans Jonas and Karl Otto Appel. But as of now, their call to this collective transformation of ethical thinking has not been met with great success. Clearly, the individual is confronted with the broad environmental claims that were mentioned at the beginning, even though the concerned phenomena are mostly social, historical, and collective. I mentioned before, the intrication between pollution, climate change, biodiversity loss, and all the other aspects. In fact, many individuals fall to anxiety in front of our environmental predicament, feeling powerless. These environmental claims are certainly not outside of the individual's purview, but the person's personal action is not counting for much overall. Countries of the first world, like the United States, Canada, Germany, or Japan, are now rejoined by relative newcomers like China and India. Their contribution to the problems have nothing comparable with the outputs of countries like Kenya or Myanmar. Therefore, the standards should differ, as is recognized by the IPCC and others, the notion of differing contributions. And there are also enormous differences among individuals. Even among the global north, discrepancies between billionaires and low-income people Tables of data are available with the required precision on these issues, one case among others being the United States. There's a paper from Starr and others about this. Which raises, of course, equity issues. One flight a year by a family of 3 cannot be equated with the person who flies literally every week or every month. We do not have a choice between 0 and 1 here. To go further would obviously require a complex set of considerations, everyone having to do their part in a shared responsibility. In that context, what is the value of the argument that we have in front of us today? One hypothesis to understand the use of the scheme or figure condemning a scientist's flight might be to consider that it could be called abusive only if taken inside an individualistic virtue ethics perspective, which is one possibility among others. For instance, in contrast with consequentialism. Frequently, it is true that many people will assume virtue ethics as a presupposition, the defect of this being often the limited understanding of virtue theory in the first place. This alignment with a limited understanding of a simplified virtue ethics position has been indirectly shown in Goodwin 2020. That article displays the advocates of the fly less movement who argue about the need of coherence, to walk the talk, as they say, as a way to enhance the credibility of the message, in contrast with the structural change advocates who emphasize the social character of the practices involved. We should take note that the research of enhancing credibility mentioned in the flyless movement is a rhetorical enterprise. It concerns ethos, moral standing, image. On the contrary, pleaders of the SC group are consequentialists. The individual's behavior here does not make a significant difference. As Goodwin noted, these people often do what they can to limit their uses of the fossil fuels, but since they themselves devaluate individual action, they do not boast about it. So she's demonstrating that on the basis of the data that she gathered in her research. They are strikingly in a defensive position, underscoring that those attacks on the individual scientist's behavior of flying diminishes the value of their position by showing elitism. From my perspective, they themselves fall to the idea of scientists as elite, which is a commonplace in all anti-science talk and a way to discredit them, especially in the United Statesian public arena. There is no appropriation of the fact that flights might be a part of their professional responsibilities as scientists. In any case, such moves of appropriation are not apparent in Goodwin's data, on which I rely here. There's also the issue of wondering if those arguments are actually produced by someone. So that's answering a non-existent arguer. The typical argumentative scheme on which we are working here can be examined in the abstract, but if we look at what is occurring, either it actually exists in the speech acts of a person or it does not. It could exist as a data, but not as an argument. Certainly, an argument can have a sort of systemic standing, be a cluster of points mobilized along a period of time by many utterers, no one arguer retaking the whole of the cluster. But it can also be the product of bots meant to disparage requirements seen by interest bearers as too demanding. Nowadays, these possibilities cannot be ignored. The supposed interest holders would then need to use complex set of algorithms as proxies to produce a multiplicity of occurrences. Such bots do not actually defend that position, for instance, accusing such and such of hypocrisy. There would be no pleader involved here, and no one would be specifically accused. Therefore, no answer would be due or required. Answers and counter-arguments would be completely irrelevant. There is just no one to answer to, and no possible dialogue. Indeed, we have to admit that the scheme studied here is quite simple, with enough generality to be produced by a machine, an AI, whether by a simpler or more complex proxy, like a generative AI or a large language model. This possibility could be explored in an empirical research, 2 steps, collecting instances of similar utterings and inquire about the nature of the argument producing in each case. And if the result of such an inquiry were to find that the subset of argument producers which are not human is not an empty set, there is obviously no requirement to answer such arguments. The only required action would be to get rid of these messages without a locutor, using something like a cleaner bot, for instance. I do not see why some AI cannot be programmed to isolate and destroy the false utterances by using a heuristic asking a series of specific questions. So to conclude, I have what I call a sophistic refutation, so I'm not sure it's going to be completely convincing, but let me try anyway. So if someone is actually holding the position discussed here, I mean disqualifying a radical prescription because of some arguer's lack of coherence, it suffices to respond that a given action, say taking a plane, is only one occurrence of one type of action in a diversified set of types of actions. That would be true even if we are talking about several plane flights being taken by the same individual, say in a given decade. The proof of this being simply the fact that a person does several things outside taking planes. For instance, using heating or cooling systems for the house, taking the bus or a car. Then the important thing is to ask to what point a person tries her best to be using less fossil fuels. For instance, in a given year, a person abandons the oil-powered car. In the year after, the person passes to geothermic heating, und so weiter, as they say in German. About moral perfectionism now, I think it's an important point of the discussion. On environmental issues, oftentimes people feel required to represent perfection incarnate on all sides. Probably because they require changes on society as a whole, they feel the need of exemplarity and virtuousness. Perfection being not of this world, it is a futile attempt to aim for it. But perfection is indeed of this world as a concept, a representation of completeness, a kind of idea. And to expect purity on all counts is like asking for the impossible. Putting the bar at the perfection level amounts to saying everything which is not perfect does not count. It is a way to dismiss all attempts, characterizing them as failures. This is where a meliorist position, as developed in the pragmatist tradition with Peirce, James Dewey, and others, is distinguished from a perfectionist position. The first position admits history and evolution, the second does not. There's also a problem with coherence from my point of view. The argument based on coherence between acts and discourses is not always a force that goes in the direction of the betterment of practices. On the contrary, this argument can feel at peace with the status quo, since any betterment of a given practice constitutes a breach with coherence. This person is eating meat all the time, is a frequent flyer, a dedicated consumer of all kinds of material goods, drive a gas guzzler, and at the same time is not a proactive citizen in environmental issues. Neither is that person making claims for the transformation of the general ethos towards more responsible choices. This kind of coherence is generally seen as something completely acceptable, even laudable. It is rarely, if ever, openly mentioned or attacked. Coherence between behaviors and speech can be a given without consequence for moral evaluation. And of course, on top of that, you could also be a very coherent criminal. I'm not saying that the person I described in the beginning is a criminal, but you can extend the same reasoning. This having been said, the need for coherence between thoughts and actions is something of importance, especially when changes are demanded because of something akin to a need of reciprocity and balance. But there is a problem with a focus on single behaviors as being in themselves good or bad. The obvious example of this is conformity to the law. It is perfectly justified to obey the law unless the law is itself unjustified and unjust in a certain regime. Then the person might obey the law, but only for personal protection without having the impression that the law in itself is justified. So if we get back to our first version another time, and probably the last one, in the following move, why should I follow X when X calls for a ban on fossil fuels, when a person frequently takes the plane? This kind of intervention obviously works against a changing of the minds, intentionally or not, and can be used for justifying a business as usual practice. It is a call blocking a type of action and not first and foremost a case of ad hominem, even if we recognize a pragmatic inconsistency. This being said, in such a move, the action that serves to discredit the prescription is only a member of the class described by the prescription, a ban on fossil fuels. The prescription, which is calling for such a ban, is something quite large, planes being only an element. Why focus only on one type of action? Indeed, fossil fuel users are required to take boats, trains, most of the cars, but also to fabricate plastics, to harvest the farmers' fields. It is instrumental in how we distribute food and how we eat, even to develop and repair roads, the build houses, and move the necessary materials, and the list goes on. If we want to discuss actions that might change our climate predicament, all the above need to be considered, and obviously, important powers have much more to do on these matters than the lesser ones. The individual consumer is an element, but regulators and the market providers obviously have a lot more to do. For instance, a single law could do much more, or a price hike could do much more too. To continue on flights, during the last 50 years, plane tickets have become cheaper for tourism and other uses, whether they be political, economic, or scientific. The number of flights has grown exponentially with one brief relapse during the pandemic. Advertisements are all over us, presenting glorious images of beaches, beautiful couples, glamorous hotels, buffets, and drinks. This invasion of images is not an individual's decision or invention. In conversations among peers, people are talking about their upcoming retirement. They have been saving for having a chance to travel, and then it will be possible. Trips to Europe, Asia, or Africa have also been greatly advertised in many ways since decades. They are part of a culture of expanding the person's experience. All of this will be praised and socially recognized as valid. Those ideas and images have been interiorized in a societal, historical, and mediatic culture. They are not limited to the individual's actions and internal desires. Suppose a person pleads for, let us say, a general turn towards actions which will reduce the probability of a dire climate in the near future. That pleading is filled with good intentions, but devoid of specific actions to be taken. There is also no specific agent to whom the prescription is given, by whom some action might be required. Even though at some general level the normative sentence is meaningful, this kind of call lacks any specific prescriptive content. All kinds of actions at different levels and of a different importance can contribute to the changing climate, one way or the other, even if some actions have no effect. If you would want to try and replace the general call with specific claims, the to-do and not-to-do list becomes very important. Eating a house, driving a car, taking the bus, plowing a field, removing some trees for urban development, etc. Lots of actions are outside the individual's capacity. For instance, repairing asphalt on the street, providing food stores with goods coming from abroad, etc. And conversely, a whole series of actions can contribute to reduce the climate's chances of being at its most destructive or perturbating force. all the actions we produce can either augment, be indifferent, or reduce the global effect, whereas the individual's part in the whole picture is globally very small. To really make sense, we have to connect economic capabilities with the behaviors. It obviously is the whole of the said action by all their enactors that has the global effect required or not. So one small detail, it seems now that the discussion about trains versus planes is ongoing. Some research recently showed that in some cases, train trips might be more damaging in terms of GHGs than planes. There was an article about that in the New York Times. So inside a given distance to cover. And of course, when you're using diesel for fuel, it's not surprising. So that's about it. Thank you so much.